Thank you very much for allowing me to present on this topic, because this is very near and dear to my heart, because it is at the core of my educator self. So before we get started with the presentation, I want to ask you to take a look at this picture. This is depicting a couple of different learning environments and students participating in those environments. If you wouldn't mind, in the chat, just what are your first thoughts when you take a look at these pictures and these learners? Excellent. So we're seeing engaged, serious, engaged, hands-on learning. Excellent. Some are working alone, some are collaborating. That's very true. So thank you for your input. Something that I think is really important to always keep in mind, that learning requires effort. Learning is very hard work, and learning for the most part is an active process. A little bit more about myself as an instructor is I started teaching at Nebraska Medicine as soon as I graduated with my bachelor's degree in medical laboratory science. I taught students on the microbiology bench, and I was very honored and blessed to be awarded some programmatic teaching awards and eventually a college level teaching award. And I felt very much, as I kept earning these honors, very much like an imposter, because I really knew deep down that I didn't know what it was to be an educator from an evidence-based practice point of view. So I decided to go back and earn my master's in education from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And it totally transformed that process, who I was as an educator. And so I'm going to share a few of those thoughts with you today. So session objectives, hopefully we'll get through three things. Number one, we're going to describe a basic information processing model for learning, including general rules for learning. I realize that learning theory isn't an exciting topic for everyone to discuss, but it was very important for me to frame my educator self within a learning theory. And so we're going to briefly talk about constructivist learning theory and how that relates to active learning. And then we're going to talk about a few active learning practices that I've either participated in or have used as an instructor. The majority of the evidence-based or brain-based or neurobiology learning theory that I'm going to talk about comes from this textbook, which is called The Unified Learning Model: How Motivational, Cognitive, and Neurobiological Sciences Inform Best Teaching Practices. It came out of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And it tries to do three things. It provides a brain-based or neurobiological based learning model. And then it discusses some contemporary learning theories and whether or not they feel that the learning model supports those learning theories. And then it also talks about applying that learning model into different educational environments. And so if you're interested in learning more about this topic, I strongly suggest utilizing this textbook. So here is a very, very, very basic model on information processing and how our brain works when it receives new stimuli, some sort of sensory stimuli, whether it be from our eyes, hearing, feeling, touching. Our emotions play a role in this. Smells play a role in this. And it goes very quickly into a sensory memory holding place just for a very brief amount of time. We are inundated with all kinds of sensory stimuli all the time. And the only way that we will remember any of it is if we decide to pay attention to it and it moves into short-term memory. It's labeled short-term memory on this model, but it's now known as working memory. And if we are ever thinking about anything, paying attention to something, concentrating on something, manipulating any type of factual information, that has to occur in our working memory. Working memory is integral to our learning process. Then it's thought that, and it isn't on this model, this representational model, but it's thought that there's another short-term holding area for all of the items that we have dealt with in our working memory during the day. And as we sleep, our brain makes a decision as to whether or not that information was important enough in our day, or it wasn't important enough. If it wasn't important enough, it's going to be forgotten again. If it is, it's going to be encoded into our long-term memory. And that's the place where it will live forever, and we are able to retrieve that memory back into our working memory so that we can actively work with, remember, manipulate some type of knowledge. So this right here, this section right here, is incredibly important to the process of learning. So what we need to do as an educator is we need to provide new sensory stimuli in the form of content to our learners. We need to ask them to be motivated enough to pay attention to that information so that it's going to be encoded into our long-term memory. And then we need to try to ask students to retrieve their long-term memory, their prior knowledge, so that it gets back into working memory. Every time that we retrieve that information, it allows our brain to efficiently retrieve it over and over and over again. It strengthens it. Our working memory is very, very limited. This is where the 7 plus or minus 2 items that we can have in our working memory at any one point in time. And that's really thought to be exaggerated. There are some references that state that really we only have 4 slots for learning elements in our working memory that we can be paying attention to at any one point in time. So it's very, very limited. And it also can pay only attention to one item at a time. So if it's holding 4 pieces of instructional or content knowledge that we brought back from our long-term memory, it can only pay attention to one of those units at a time. Our brain does not multitask. That's a falsehood. It can switch back and forth very quickly, but it can't multitask. So this is the basic information processing model that happens when our brain is trying to learn new information. And it happens at the neuron level. So neurons form neural networks that allow for knowledge storage and retrieval. So our neurons are what's doing the work when we are encoding and retrieving prior knowledge into our working memory again. Working memory has limited capacity, as we talked about, in the number of knowledge units that can be in working memory at any one point in time. If it gets overloaded, it dumps something out to make room for something new. And retrieving, again, knowledge strengthens those neural networks. So we talk about a knowledge unit here, and a knowledge unit for the novice can mean just a few factual pieces of information, but for an expert, it can mean thousands of pieces of factual information. So what we want to try to do is create these neural networks that incorporate prior knowledge with new knowledge, so that network and what we bring in contains larger and larger and larger amounts of information. I work in clinical microbiology, or I did for many years. And when I think of Staphylococcus aureus, which anybody in healthcare knows about Staphylococcus aureus and what it can do in terms of pathogenesis. If I ask a novice, one of my students, to write down everything that they know about Staph aureus, they may take a little bit of time to spell it out. They may say that it's a pathogen. They may say that it's gram-positive cocci. There may be a few superficial details that they're remembering. When I think of Staphylococcus aureus, I can smell it. I can see what it looks like. I can remember the consistency on the plate, basic biochemical information on the organism, susceptibility patterns. So my knowledge unit about Staphylococcus aureus contains a lot of information. The novice contains just a little bit of information. And as an instructor, one of the things that what I want to do is I want to help the student in this cycle of retrieving prior knowledge, incorporating it with new knowledge. And as I do that, it makes this retrieval much more efficient. So let's move on to what the Unified Learning Model calls some general rules of learning. These may be different in different resources, but it pretty much captures what's happening in working memory. So number one, new learning requires attention. We have to be motivated to pay attention so that working memory is going to allow us to manipulate or pay attention to some type of knowledge. So working memory attends to input. We need to be motivated to pay attention to it. Emotion makes that remembering a little bit easier. And then if at night while we're sleeping, it's deemed that that information is important based on what we've done with it during the day, then it's stored in long-term memory. So new learning requires attention. Learning also requires repetition. So neurons are strengthened by activation, and practice retrieving information or skills is what causes those neurons to have to be fired. And every time a neuron fires, it gets more efficient at firing, and it happens on a much quicker. So the analogy that I like to use with this is this dirt walking path here. We can get from point A to point B. We're going to be able to carry a small amount of information as we're getting from point A to point B, and it's going to take us a while to get there. But as we continue to practice and we retrieve that information from long-term memory, those neural networks become very efficient and they strengthen into a 3-lane highway. So it allows us to get from point A to point B much quicker, and it also allows us to carry much more information or cargo as we're going from point A to point B. So learning requires repetition, and learning is about connections. When we retrieve something and we have prior knowledge and we're incorporating it with new knowledge, those neurons are firing together and they will always fire together. That's how we build those intense amounts of information that I have in my one learning unit for Staph aureus. So knowledge is a connected pattern of neurons. We want all of those neurons to fire together, so when I need to bring something into working memory and manipulate it and think about it and do something with that information, I'm bringing in lots of factual information, not just a couple of strands of neurons and a couple of facts. And learning is about learning. So learning may be different per an individual's motivation. It may be different based on somebody's preferences, but at the neuron level, all neurons learn the same way. I'm using that analogy with the spoon, is that a spoon is a spoon. They may look differently. They may hold things a little differently. They may be used for different purposes, but ultimately a spoon is a spoon. And so ultimately learning at the neuron level is learning. So you may have a preference for how you like to take in new content, whether it be reading or video. You may be more, again, motivated to pay attention to a particular type of stimuli, sensory stimuli. That information may be used for different purposes, but ultimately for efficient learning, what we need to do is retrieve prior knowledge and integrate it with new information to build and reinforce our neural networks. So I'm going to stop there. And let's just briefly review what I've gone over here. So, and anyone can just shout out if you have something to add. So what do we know about working memory? Stored, it helps. It's needed for long-term memory. Is it limited, or is it's unlimited in terms of what we can, how we can use it? It can be forgotten. Is it limited or unlimited? What do you think? Working memory.
Is it unlimited?
Unlimited, thank you. No, it's limited.
It's limited.
It's limited. So this is where we can it only has like 4 slots in working memory for us to be thinking about a particular topic. So that's working memory. What do we know about a neuron? Yeah, neurons. So learning is learning, strengthened when activated or fired. They're also, it's also the cell. The unified learning model indicates how they describe nature versus nurture, and that nature is our anatomy of our brain, and that for the most part we're very similar in the anatomy of our brain. But the nurture is in the microarchitecture of our brain, which is the neural structure and the neural network, in which we are very, very unique individuals. So our brains are all somewhat similar at the macroscopic level, but at the microscopic level can be very, very unique. If we are trying to learn something new, what does it require? Interest or attention. We have to be motivated to pay attention to something so that we are actively engaged and involved. Learning is an active process. It's not a passive process. What is something else that we need to be thinking about when we're trying to learn something or develop a learning activity that's going to reinforce our students building those neural networks? What do we need to provide? Learning activities should provide repetition, effort, yeah, so it should be active, right?
Mhm.
And I think we've already covered this. Learning is learning at the neuron level. Learning is learning. So, so just what we've talked about so far. If we want to incorporate what we know about the neurobiology of the brain in those very, very simplistic model ways, what do you think we need to do as instructors to reinforce learning for our students? Provide practice. Yep. How about incorporating activities that require retrieval, right? So we want to get the students involved in that one part of the information processing model where we are retrieving things from long-term memory, bringing them back into working memory, hopefully incorporating new things with our prior knowledge, and that gets moved back into our long-term memory. And so we also need the right amount of stimuli, yes. And then what else? So we want to also help our learners create connections. Again, that prior learning and our prior knowledge with our new content or our new information. So this is providing an example of how you might want to quickly provide some active learning strategies. This is an active learning strategy in which I'm asking you questions and we're documenting them during a presentation of a PowerPoint. I've never done that before. It's hard to talk and type. Okay, this is my only, thank you very much for participating and providing some of those answers. It's very much appreciated. So this is my only slide on constructivist learning theory. So if you are a constructivist, you believe that learners construct knowledge through their experiences rather than just passively taking in information, and that new knowledge is incorporated into prior knowledge. So as an instructor, if I believe that, what is my responsibility as an educator? Constructivist learning theory was built upon Piaget's work, in that humans make their own understanding of the world, and there were 4 stages in that learning process that Piaget believed in and documented. And then John Dewey, who was an educational reformer and American philosopher and psychologist, he felt that learning was very much a social activity, a very active social activity. It was very important for me when I learned about constructivist learning theory and about the information processing model and how they went together, and how that changed how I thought about myself as an instructor. Previously, I taught primarily with a lecture, which is very important. We have to disseminate knowledge in some way, shape, or form, and that's one way we can do it. But it was pretty much left there, lecture, and then there was some sort of assessment at some point in time, and maybe a few application exercises in between. But as I started thinking about how individuals learn, I thought that I really needed to alter how I engaged with learners in a very different way. I needed to create learning activities that were much more active and not passive, more learner-centered and less passive. So constructivist learning theory for me led straight into active learning, in which learners are actively engaged. Remember, constructivist learning theory said it is not a passive activity. Learners learn from their experiences. It's very active. This is a very learner-centered process. We are asking learners to build on their prior knowledge or their experiences by a practice in environments with various complexities. So as an educator, what is your responsibility in creating active learning strategies? So let's go back to our icons from when we were talking about the rules of learning. So active learning strategies. So what do I need to do when I'm building an active learning exercise to create efficient learning? Number one, I need to motivate my students to pay attention to the content, whether or not that is explaining why this is important to them as a practitioner, which is a great way to get them motivated and emotionally engaged in what you're trying to communicate to them. Then learning requires repetition. So I need to provide some type of practice in these active learning strategies, hopefully taking content and applying it to the real world or a simulation of what's happening in the real world. And then to create those large schema or those large chunks of information so that they're bringing in lots of factual information with a memory instead of just small amounts. We need to help them create connections. And so that's going to turn this very slow dirt walking path into this 3-lane highway, which moves information very efficiently and quickly, but also it can carry large cargo, large amounts of information in those learning chunks. So this is a great book for just the nitty-gritty on examples of active learning strategies that you can incorporate into various learning environments. How can you make a lecture more interactive? Discussion sessions, writing, students teaching other students a particular concept or a skill. Talks about graphic organizers and reflection and reading, making that a little bit more active by asking students to answer questions or help focus their reading. And then academic games, which we all know most students love. Prior to incorporating active learning strategies into your teaching, I strongly suggest that you explain to your learners or your students why you feel it's important that they participate in this particular activity. Let's say it's a case study. Sometimes learners don't appreciate when they're being asked to be more active in the learning process. As a student, I was very comfortable when I knew I could go to Lincoln and sit in my classroom and just listen to the instructor do all the work. And I could just passively be in and engage in some point in time, or I could just totally, because I was tired, just kind of zone out and not pay attention, and the instructor wouldn't know one way or the other. It's in the comfort zone for a lot of learners to be very passive in the classroom, and it puts them outside of their comfort zones when we're asking them to be very active. So I always start an active learning exercise with explaining to the students why I think this is incredibly important for them to become a better professional. I tend to teach using a flipped classroom or a blended classroom. Find it very hard to do that in faculty development situations where we're just meeting once. But for my students, what I like to do is present the content in some type of video or reading, and they interact with that on their own prior to our classroom session. They are held accountable by doing some sort of activity prior to the classroom session so that I know that they have interacted with the content, and it also serves as a self-assessment for them, just to make sure that they have a feel for how much that they've retained or they understand of the content. Then when we get together and I'm with them, the focus of that time is active learning time. I'm asking them to utilize that new content in some sort of application, whether it be pulling in prior knowledge that we've talked about, comparing and contrasting, but having them apply that information in some way, shape, or form. And that's the focus of our classroom time. If you are teaching a unit or a module where there is going to be some sort of high stakes evaluation at the end for the student, there really needs to be something between presenting the content and doing that high stakes assessment. We need to help them retrieve that information, and we need to help them build those neural networks. So there needs to be some application active learning activity, whether or not it's done synchronously or asynchronously, but there needs to be something beyond just the lecture and an assessment. So something where they can do some sort of self-assessment so that they know where they are with that material and what their understanding is. So now we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about some various active learning strategies that I've used in my teaching or I participated in as a student. Case studies, we are all very aware of case studies. These can be medical case studies. These can just be application of information case studies. Can be as simple as just asking students questions about the content if they're not ready for a full case study. It allows students, again, to retrieve information as they're trying to answer questions and work their way through the case study or the question. They are applying facts to a particular situation. Learners get to practice making decisions based on any algorithms that might be used, decision-making trees. It allows them to utilize real-world resources. And this can be done in a very safe environment that's not complex. So I often get the question, well, Karen, often in medical education, healthcare education, we give a lecture, and then we do provide some sort of application exercise by doing some type of simulation, some type of hands-on laboratory, clinical rotations. So why do we need to do this piece in the classroom? It just seems to take up a little bit more time than if we just do a lecture. But let's think about complexity here. When we're asking students to interact with simulation dummies, or we're asking them to work with equipment, if we're asking them to work with patients, those are very, very complex environments. And so it provides, if we can use the classroom to allow them to apply and think through an algorithm from a cognitive point of view, then they practice that before they get into that more complex environment where maybe they have to interact with the patient or they're having to work with a piece of equipment for the very first time. In my world, oftentimes that's a microscope. And I wish I would have been able to capture this in a more objective way. But anecdotally, when we started incorporating more cognitive practice before they moved into the laboratory setting, it decreased the stress in the laboratory tremendously because the students kind of knew from an algorithmic point of view how they should go from point A to point B to point C. And now we're just adding more complexity by adding equipment or more interactions or just a more stressful, hustly bustly environment for them to have to think in. So I find these very, very effective, and it decreases the student's stress level when they get to the more complex environment. Audience response systems, these have been around forever. I've used these for many, many years. It used to be that you had little receivers and they were, you couldn't do them remotely. Now they're very easy to use in a web system. They're normally part of most learning management systems. I like audience response systems because you get real information in real time, so that you as the expert can shift your response, or what you're going to say, or what your discussion points during a particular session are going to be, based on what you're getting back from the students in real time about what they understand, the information, how they're understanding application of new information. It can allow you to identify at-risk learners before high-stakes assessment. So if you are doing a face-to-face classroom situation and you're asking for students to just kind of call out and answer if you ask a question, oftentimes who you're going to hear are the students that have a good understanding of the information. Those might be 20% of your class. The other 80%, you don't know where they stand in terms of understanding of the information. And so that's where the audience response system, they're anonymous for the learner, but for the instructor, the facilitator, you can go back and see who's struggling and who isn't, and maybe identify some at-risk learners before they do take a high-risk, a high-stake assessment. This is just an example of, we use this, one of our very first sessions, we talk about a clinical laboratory procedure, the different components. And so we were just asking students, where would you find in a laboratory procedure where to learn about preparation of reagents, right? So everybody got that right. So we have a pretty good understanding that our students feel pretty comfortable with that information. So we don't really need to take class time in reinforcing that. But when we ask them, where would you find the test methodology principle? We had our answers scattered across all 4 of the answer choices. So it told the instructor right then and there that students didn't have a good understanding of this concept. And so we took some time to discuss what's the difference between the methodology area versus the procedure area, which is where they were having some sort of confusion. Making connections, mind maps. So this is where you have a student maybe start with a concept and just go through and connect the dots with different factual information. I used to teach a microbiology course to PA students where it was really helping them make the connection between a potential pathogen and how they were going to diagnose it, what laboratory tests they would order, and then what the results of those diagnostic tests meant for the patient. And the students would oftentimes get incredibly overwhelmed with all of the independent, siloed, factual pieces of information. And so we would spend some time at the end of the class hour kind of putting things together in terms of how they would think through that information with the patient. So what symptoms did the patient have? Maybe they had a sore throat. So what would be your differential diagnosis, viral versus bacterial? And then how would you use the laboratory to help you diagnose that and make that differential diagnosis? And so they would put the information together in a correlational chart so that they could see how everything fit together and they could organize it in their heads a little bit more. And I can create my own correlational chart but they really needed to create their own so that it made sense to them and it brought in what their prior knowledge was. This picture here is a bacteria on a particular type of media. And again, if I was going to ask my novice learners to tell me everything that you know about these bacteria just based on this one picture alone, they would probably come up with a couple of factual, pretty superficial pieces of information. But I, as an expert, when I see that picture, it brings in all of this factual information that I know from my experiences. And I can have a very easily a 50-minute conversation on what these organisms are, what it means to grow on these pieces of media, what does it mean to be mucoid and not mucoid, what does that mean to our immune system, what is that going to mean to antibiotics, organisms that aren't growing on this media, how can we differentiate those, how does everything come together as a whole, how does it all fit, the puzzle pieces of the factual information fit together. And when you do something like this in class, what it does is it models deep content connections. So it models you as an expert, how you're just taking this one picture and how you have developed your neural networks and your connections and how that is going to impact you when you're trying to apply this information in your professional realm. So it's a great modeling tool to say, as an expert, I can have a 50-minute conversation on this one picture. A great modeling for students. Brainstorming tools. I have not used this in class, but there are some free programs out there. This is called Miro, which basically works as a sticky note and flip chart, but just in a virtual world. It doesn't take a whole lot of time to learn how to use it. I've used it a couple of times, and I think it's a great tool for brainstorming that you might have to do in a virtual environment. Reflection. Reflection is so important to our students. So we want to teach our students to reflect on something so that they can learn how to reflect in something. We all know how important feedback is, efficient, effective, constructive feedback is to our learners, to help them progress in how they're doing a particular skill, how they're handling a particular situation. But when we require our students to reflect, it's allowing them to learn how to provide feedback for themselves. As a professional, it is our professional duty to continually improve, and part of that is reflecting. What went well? What didn't go well? How would I change that the next time I run into that particular situation? So we can ask students to reflect on many different levels. One is just, what did I learn today? I used to teach a microbiology course for MLS students. It was very overwhelming. We ended the day in a laboratory situation. Some people got done earlier than others. We never really had a wrap up. And I felt that that the students needed to at least sit down and just reflect on what just happened here. I did about 50 different things and what happened. So at the end of the lab, they had to, in a journal, yes, we journaled in a microbiology laboratory, they needed to, at a minimum, write down one thing that they knew that they conquered during that classroom session and laboratory session. I really know that I understand this and I'm going to remember it. And then they needed to write down, this is something that I know that I do not have a clear understanding on. I need to go back and review it for whatever reason. So when they would feel overwhelmed and they would tell me, Karen, I go home at night and I just don't even know where to begin to start studying and reviewing this material, I said, that's where you want to go back and review that item that you said, I know, I don't understand this. I need to spend more time with it. That's where you start. It gives them a starting point. Students that you work with on a longitudinal basis for a year, a month, 2 years, learning is hard work, and it can be very, students can start to feel very defeated, that they're not making the progress that they feel that they should. I often found the pattern with students is that when they would start learning superficially some of those basics, they would say, I've got this, I understand. And then you start bringing more complexity to them, and they kind of come to that realization of, oh my gosh, the more I know I don't know. And that can be very defeating to the student. So I would tell them to go back to their learning logs when they were writing things down at the beginning of the program and report back to me the next day to say, do you think you've learned some things? And they would always come back walking a little taller the next day, smiled at me and said, you know what? Some of the things I said I didn't understand, I have a good concept of right now. So I do know that I'm learning things. I just know that I have a long way to go. And then practicum reflections, when students are in those incredibly enriched environments where they are doing clinical rotations and practicums, I would ask students, again, we're working in the clinical lab, I would ask them, well, what'd you do this week? How'd it go? And they would just list things, tasks that they did and the area that they were in. And they really weren't going back and reflecting on the more complex learning that goes on in those very rich environments. So we ask them, we guide this a little bit, but we ask them to pick a particular experience that happened during the week, evaluate how it went. Was it a positive? Was it a neutral? Was it a somewhat negative experience that we know that we can grow from? And so that when we force them to do that reflection, again, we're asking them to learn how to reflect on something so that they can eventually reflect in. So when they are in a similar situation, they can think back and say, well, maybe I need to change my course of action here and utilize a different strategy that they thought about previously. And then this isn't in your handout if you do have a handout, but this is something that a lot of multimedia videos are now utilizing. It's a way for us, if we're asking our learners to watch something asynchronously on their own time, it's a way to grab their attention again. It's a way for them to practice that retrieval right at the time that we're doing the presentation. And that's where, in this particular vendor here, there are many, call it a poll instead of a question, but within the video itself, it's pretty easy to plop in some type of a question that the student has to answer before they can progress in the video. Some of our competencies have used this. So this is a way on an asynchronous platform that we can grab our students' attention again and ask them to be actively involved in retrieving some type of information. So that was a lot. So just a quick overview of what we've done in the last 50 minutes or so is we reviewed some basic information processing, a basic information processing model that depicted the very importance of working memory, which has a limited capacity, and how information can go from working memory into long-term memory. And that as an instructor, we really want to think about reinforcing that retrieval, that prior knowledge, and integrating it with new information. And that can require practice, and repetition. And again, we want to build very enriched neural networks that integrate our prior knowledge with new knowledge, so that when we're thinking of even one thing, it brings in all of this memory and factual information that we can use as we're trying to manipulate it or make decisions. And then we talked a little bit about constructivist learning theory, which is knowledge, which indicates that knowledge is based on experiences. So what does that mean to us as an instructor? We want to create active learning experiences. Learning is not passive, it's active. And we want to actively have our students practice applying facts to situations. And with that, I am done. Do we have any questions? We have a little bit of time left.
Dr. Honeycutt, I don't have a question, but I do have an observation. What I've just learned from you applies to myself, the classroom, and in training. It's interesting in that you also said that we can't multitask at the very beginning. And I think that's something we all think we can do, but obviously we can't do. But the active participation, so as we learn things, we need to actively do them just to connect. But also you talked about how this works with the adult learners. So I learned a lot myself. Thank you, Dr. Honeycutt. This was very good, as I mentioned, and thank you everyone for attending. This was something I hope you can walk away with and apply what you've learned today.
Thank you, everybody.